All right, we are starting week 3. We're going to look a little bit at some financial mathematics, um, simple compound interest, inflation, and then our tax code here in America. Um, Goal is to get us a little more familiar with some of the stuff as we move on to future weeks and talk about things like wealth distribution with a little more detail. So, just starting off and going through the notes, uh, even though it says personal finance management at the top, it's really just going to be some basics about financial mathematics. So I always start with a quote. If you lend someone $20 and never see them again, it was probably worth it. A true mathematician's attitude on people. All right, but we are looking at determining the value of money, in which we consider not only the amount, but also at what point in time we are determining its value. This is true in loans and investments, etc. So the initial amount of a loan or a deposit is what we call the principal. Right? The amount of value money gains over time is what we call interest or interest earned. Right? And this interest is usually computed as a percent of the principal. Right? In other words, an interest rate, a certain percent of whatever the principal was. So interest calculated only on principal is what we're going to deal with this right now, and that is called simple interest. All right. Later, when we calculate interest on the principal plus any previously earned interest, we will talk about that. That is called compound interest. But here we're just working about simple interest. So, as mentioned, right, we describe this interest or determine this interest as a percent of some principal value, right? And so we compute it by taking the interest earned per period is equal to our principal amount multiplied by whatever our rate is for that period. Typically, we will deal with annual rates unless otherwise specified, right? Multiplied by time, the number of periods. So, for example, the number of years over which we're drawing interest or earning interest on this. So, I is equal to PRT, P times R times T, something we've probably seen before. So if we're trying to find the simple interest paid to borrow $5,350 for 5 months at a 6% annual interest rate, we would simply take the principal, multiply it by the rate, which is our percent of the principal that earns interest, all right? And then we multiply by how much of that rate we really get to apply. In other words, 5 months isn't a whole year, so we don't earn that whole 6%, all right? Or it isn't earned on our loan. Right? So 5/12 of that percent is earned. So we would take all those numbers and multiply them together to yield what our interest is. Right? And so at the end of 5 months, the question is how much would we have to repay? Whoever borrowed it have to repay. Well, the amount to be repaid is going to be the future value of our original amount. In other words, it's going to be the amount borrowed plus whatever interest earned. So that original $5,350 plus whatever interest we earned. Well, let's take a second and make sure we know how to compute interest. So simple interest, right? The principal was $5,350. The rate we were earning it was earning was 6% annually. And then we kept it for 5/12 of a year. In other words, earned interest for 5 months, 5/12 of that rate. So if I take these numbers and I multiply them together, that should get us the interest earned, and then the future value, or the amount we have to pay back, would be the principal plus, right, would be the principal plus whatever interest we earned. Right? So there we go. So this would be the future value. Now, the reason I'm making this video, despite sort of simple interest being something we've dealt with before, because this is assuming I'm making no payments, right? In other words, the future value means that I didn't pay off anything during that 5 months, all right? So that value wasn't lessened. I'm wanting to introduce Excel a little bit to us. So for example, the way I structured it, I could easily then compute what interest would be earned. All right, this should be interest. All right, if for example I had a 7% rate, So if I just change this number, because in this box you see I selected it to be equal to this cell multiplied by this cell multiplied by this cell, it will automatically update my computations relative to wherever I've entered those things. So now I've got 8%. And notice that since I did the same thing over here in terms of referencing, right, F4, this cell, added on with my 5350, as I change the interest rate, right, everything else changes as well. Okay. So the future value, or the amount I'll have to pay back at the end, given the original question, is $5,483.75. Now I could also change this. Now what if it was the whole year, right? What if it were 2 years, etc. Right? So one of the things you may be used to, we're going to get a little used to in this week, is playing around with Excel. And I'll adjust our homework to make sure we're focused on that and we're approachable, accessible. So that's simple interest. Right? Very straightforward. So future value or maturity value is, again, you take the principal and you multiply by, or you add on with whatever interest is earned, right? So you take the principal and add principal times rate times time. Or we often factor out the principal and write it as P times the quantity 1 plus R times T, right? So that's the future value, right? The present value, all right, is often what we describe as, in some cases we'll just refer to it as the principal, but that's when I'm given the future value. In other words, I maybe need to save up $1,000 over the next 6 years, and I'm earning a certain interest rate. I want to know what present value I have to start with. In other words, what principal do I need to put away, deposit? And so that is just taking the P here and solving for it from this equation. So in other words, you see we divide through by 1 plus R times T, and we get the future value we're looking to have divided by that quantity will give us whatever present value we need to start with. So here are two basic examples that I want you to try. All right, example 2 and example 3. There's a spot right here in the Excel things, the Excel sheets that I'm giving you to work them out. And the idea is to try to get used to, all right, playing around with Excel while also figuring out, all right, do I know what present and future value? What are these questions asking for? Because they're a little different. From there, we're going to move on to compound interest, and then we're going to get used to the idea of, well, sometimes when you've got these sort of loans or investments, you are contributing more money or withdrawing money. Well, that changes the dynamic here, right? But simple interest is where we start. So have at it.